Hello, and welcome to the Humanistic Counselor, a podcast in which we discuss, analyze, critique, and celebrate both well-established and cutting-edge ideas across the field of humanistic counseling. I'm Brett Wilkinson, Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Humanistic Counseling, otherwise known as JHC. I'd like to welcome Dr. Cian Brown, a licensed professional counselor and supervisor in Oklahoma and Arkansas, and faculty member in the counseling program at the University of Oklahoma. He earned his PhD in counselor education and supervision from the University of Arkansas, specializing in adventure therapy. As an existential humanistic counselor, he approaches meeting people as whole human beings, and he believes that change occurs by focusing on individual strengths, personal growth, and finding meaning in life. Dr. Brown, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Delighted to be here with you and excited to dive into the conversation today.
Great. Well, today we'll be discussing your 2025 JHC theoretical and conceptual article entitled Navigating Adventure Therapy, Using Existential Theory as a Guide. Before we discuss the article itself, why don't you tell us, what is adventure therapy and what inspired your interest in it?
Sure, yeah. So adventure therapy, I see as a therapeutic tool that uses experiential activities to bring about behavioral, emotional, and psychological change ultimately. So kind of creating this container and taking therapy outside of the traditional room and engaging through these kinesthetic activities, whether that be some form of adventure or it might be outdoors or it could even be within another built environment.
So it's a really big umbrella term for a lot of different practices that are adventure-oriented and exploratory-oriented.
Yes, certainly. And I think under that umbrella, there's a lot of different fields that we might consider like nature-based therapy. We might consider wilderness therapy. And so it's really a developing definition, but I think that consensus is this exploration or the use of these kinesthetic activities to bring about that therapeutic change ultimately.
And what drew you to adventure therapy?
Yeah, so about 10 years ago, when I was working as a school based mental health counselor, I noticed that the students or the clients I was working with didn't really connect with that traditional sit and talk approach that I had been taught. And so I was challenged to really think outside the walls of that traditional counseling space. And I wanted to engage my clients that I worked with where they were at. So thinking from that developmental lens, that there's the importance of play and that being our earliest form of communication. And then as they get older, I was working with a lot of adolescents. There was those influences of those peer relationships and developing pro-social behaviors and how that informed their identity. So when I started to notice a lot of the students or clients that I was working with in the schools, they were like eager to move. They wanted to explore. They wanted to get out of that confined space, seeing that they were sitting at desks most of the day and literally wanting to get out. So that led me to start asking myself, like, how do I meet my clients where they're at? And so as I started to explore that question with the help of some mentors and supervisors at that time, I came across what I thought to be adventure-based counseling and later turned into the term adventure therapy. And so I began to learn and integrate that into my work, which eventually led me to the University of Arkansas. But that ultimately took my work outside of the traditional counseling space to other parts of the school grounds. So sometimes in the gymnasium, sometimes outside the school building, either the blacktop or a playground or something outside. So really that desire to work with my clients where they were and find a means that fostered those conditions for them and supported their curiosity and that potential for change. But it also wanted to recognize their freedom, their choice, their responsibility, and how to live more congruently with them, set their authentic selves. Right.
So you start the article by arguing that a lot of counselors approach therapy from a theoretical stance.
Mm.
So they're approaching things without a theoretical orientation. And so you and your colleagues in this article see this as problematic. And then you argue that existentialism is a particularly valuable theory to guide clinical work in adventure therapy. So could you share why you think approaching adventure therapy atheoretically is a problem and why existentialism is well suited to fill the gap?
Certainly, yeah. I think from our training or my training specifically, and the approach that I was given is that the theoretical foundation is key to guiding the process. And so, the challenge with approaching adventure therapy, which is I see as a modality or that vehicle without a theoretical framework, is that it can end up looking a lot more like recreation rather than therapy. So without that theoretical grounding, we're risking missing those opportunities for that deeper level of change. Um, for me personally, my theory is existential humanistic. I inherently seek meaning in the actions that we take and how we go about being in the world or a part of the world. But I find that that's easy to avoid or ignore, especially when it's something that's challenging or requires that reflection, and requiring us to take responsibility. So I see existentialism really fitting well because it speaks to those universal struggles. We're all facing those core conditions that Yalom terms, such as freedom, responsibility, isolation, finality, and then especially that meaning making, that Viktor Frankl really talks about in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. So when I look at adventure therapy, this naturally brings all of those themes to life through choice and consequences, the decisions that clients are taking, the risk that they're approaching, and then having to go through that reflective process. So it's like, for an example, I would say, what does this choice say about how I face challenges in life?
Mm.
Um, what risks am I taking or avoiding as I approach this element or this task? When we start to combine those two, adventure therapy and existentialism, um, I see this powerful way to help people live more authentically. So that's how adventure therapy becomes more about meaning making and not just like an activity or recreation.
And I'd imagine that, developmentally speaking, and having started your exploration of this in work with adolescents and children, that developmentally speaking, you'd find it was really resonant with a lot of teenagers.
Mm, yes, you're right. So I think when it comes back down to, yes, that identity and meaning making, and that idea of self creation, that I have some agency, really
Mhm.
exploring that. And when I was working with these um, clients and even beyond adolescence, even when I'm working with students and when we're thinking about our professional identity, again, we're coming back to how do we seek and make meaning of our experience of being a part of the world, being in the world. So I think about those terms of what are the things that are influencing us. And I really liked your article that talking about the ecological and active approach, right? That in activism and having these embodied experiences and those things that influence us. And I think of that in terms of how we can create false meaning. So we're giving meaning to
Mm.
things such as wealth, status, or powers, whereas that might provide some immediate value or meaning, but it is ultimately going to be unfulfilling. And research has gone to show. Whereas others might find that transitionary meaning, where they find meaning in their work or relationships or a sense of service to the
Mhm.
community, which are all valuable things, but kind of lack that bigger question of existence. And so, what my focus was how do these clients, these students, adolescents, or young adults, my students, how are they engaging with the world? What are they reflecting on and going through in that process, and really recognize in terms of their true self?
Yes, yes. Okay. And so let's talk about risk taking, and consequences. You go on in the article to connect a lot of various adventure therapy processes like adventure activities and managing risk and natural consequences to Binswanger's Lebensfeld dimensions, the Umwelt, Midfeld, Eigenfeld. How do you connect these ideas?
Yeah. So again, thinking about us being in the world and kind of figuring out like what it is to be a part of this world, and especially if there's this absurdity of all these things that are occurring. Levin welts, those the welts are provided as those dimensional layers of our existence, right? So the umwelt, which is capturing our relationship to the physical world, including one's own physical body and those limitations. So I think about, let's take a client mountain biking, which was what my dissertation was focused on. They're learning directly from the terrain, and they're also receiving that feedback in terms of learning how to balance, finding a rhythm, and navigating those trails while also understanding their own limits. And then when we take in the Mitwell, which relates to their relationship to others, those connections to people or the social world, I find that's the really one of the drives for why I approached this was because of those peer relationships, right? And having to interact and learn from one another. So this gives them that opportunity to encourage their peers or wait for someone who's struggling or decide to wait, really having a choice, or work through those group challenges and attend to how they interact or relate to those others. One example I had, I was working with a group and they had all different skill levels. And so they lined up and they were going through the trail and they ended up like crashing and running into each other and really struggling on the trail. And so we had to process, how can we be supportive of one another and work through this, and also have a good experience. And so they had to
Mhm.
really process that and see how they can really problem solve that activity and then also engage with it while being supportive. Um,
Yeah.
and then I have the Eigenwelt, right? So this is like their perceptions of their inner world, that conscious self or that inner dialogue that they all have. So after we ride, my clients may reflect on their fear of falling, or their pride in finishing an activity. And so making meaning of that experience when what that says about them as a person.
Yeah.
So then, I mean, Van Derzen as talks about the Uberwelt, which is
Mhm.
that representing that individual's relationship to that spiritual self or the transcendent self. So if you haven't explored the Ryan Reese's work on eco wellness, he talks about that
Mhm.
transcendent dimension of having a connection with the natural world. But this really captures those values and purpose that show up when we start to ask those bigger questions, such as what is my purpose? What am I connected to? Why am I here? So I see adventure therapy really effectively drawing together all those dimensions of the physical,
Yeah.
social, personal, spiritual, and empowering the clients that I worked at to develop both meaning and a deeper sense of being and relating to those dimensions.
And something I relate to about this that I really appreciate about your article, you mentioned my article earlier, and so
Hmm.
I'll dovetail it a little bit. This idea that, as I spoke to in that in activism article, that all these Lebensfeld dimensions are overlapping and interconnected. They're not actually separate. They're categorically separate in our minds, but
Hmm.
really they all come together into the same thing. And I appreciate this in an article, the way you show the overlap, because the experience of risk taking, and I'd like to get your thought on this experience of risk taking, like you said, an adolescent riding a mountain bike and taking the risk and nearly crashing. There is a sense in which the capacity for risk taking that grows through their connection with the bike on the mountain in the Uberwelt also connects to their sense of risk taking capacities relationally,
Hmm.
because, and to themselves, their sense of being a risk taking person, or the world, the Uberwelt, the spirit, as in I'm the type of person, or this is the type of world in which one can take risks, that there's a tremendous amount of overlap. So I would imagine you see in adventure therapy where the process of engaging in, say, mountain biking and being on the bike and that Uber dimension, that it translates over into all the other areas as well. Just being in that embodied process translates, and risk taking becomes something in all those areas, not through separate acts, but through the same act. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, certainly. I think they're all informing and influencing one another. As you were sharing that, I think about Yalom's uh, position on courage and that courage to be vulnerable, and that when we're vulnerable, we're risking to be known, that true self of to be known, and to be loved. And to love is to also risk loss and that grief. And so,
Mm-hmm.
as we engage in these activities, there's these like various levels of risk that we engage in, and how does that transcend from that activity to other areas of your life. And what I found when I was working with these group of kids is that it also provided them this opportunity to connect with their families who were not present. It's now something that I have to do with my dad. And then I watched one student who at the beginning of the program had a lot of negative self-talk, and then as we progressed through the program, he started to say, you know what, Mr. Brown, like I'm going to do this because if I don't try, I've already failed. And started to
Mm.
change his language and his approach to how he was challenging himself. And I think that's something that's also really great about these activities is it's really a direct relationship to one's self. You're only really competing with yourself, and not to make it about the competition, but what is that inner dialogue and how do you change that through this risk taking and being vulnerable with yourself, what those limits are that we possess.
Right, right. So you've touched on so many different key terms, a lot of them existential here. In the article, you also outlined 7 adventure beliefs that guide the adventure therapy process: safety, challenge, belonging, freedom, trust, enjoyment, and effective communication. So, why don't you tell us a bit more about these beliefs and how you connect them to existential themes?
Yeah, sure. So this is something that I came to learn later in my time as an adventure therapist, and this was developed by Tony Alvarez and his colleagues who outlined in their book, The Adventure Group Psychotherapy, those 7 adventure beliefs. And they believe that these set the conditions for that space to invite clients into and engage and encourage them to confront those existential tenets that we've been discussing. So, for example, when we talk about establishing a sense of safety, this provides clients that sense of courage to face those perceived or actual limits. And then when we talk about challenge, as we've kind of hinted at, that's inviting that sense of growth by stepping toward or into risk that may be real or perceived. And that provides those opportunities to discover that, oh, I'm stronger than I actually thought. And then they have belonging, and that's pushing against that ideal of isolation by showing others they can be a part of a group without losing themselves, their authentic selves in that case. Freedom, which directly ties in with existentialism, but that's highlighting that one's choice, responsibility, that sense of agency, where each decision they make in an activity mirrors one's life choices. Then we have trust and communication, which help deepen that authenticity. So when we talked about like vulnerability, because it can be a risk to be truly vulnerable with others, and it helps the clients realize that while I'm both separate, I'm also connected. And then lastly, the enjoyment reminds us that meaning isn't only found in the struggle. So one of my mantras was to suffer. What if we're to suffer, that we suffer well. So a lot of my students will hear me say, suffer well when they're wrestling with something, but that we we can also find meaning through joy, laughter, and play, and that's just as much a part of our part of being. So it seems like once we're able to confront these difficult aspects of the human condition, that we start to like recognize and cherish how truly beautiful world and life we are to live. So I think those adventure beliefs really shape that therapeutic space and help clients, where they're not just doing activities, they're like starting to develop who they are and discovering what gives their life meaning in that process.
And existentialism also often gets a bad rap or is mischaracterized as somewhat dark or negative or shadowy. Early students in counselor education always come in with this impression, when in reality it's very much a celebration. So I appreciate enjoyment being part of
Hmm.
it in your articulation
Yeah.
of that. There's so much spiritedness, I would imagine, when you're out in some activity with kids, adults, whoever, doing adventure therapy.
Hmm.
And there's risk and challenge, but there's also just can be pure enjoyment and an aliveness
Hmm.
that some people haven't experienced maybe enough in their life. Do you think that's true?
Certainly, I think even more so now. I was presenting it for a conference and saw that over the last 200 years, where we have a 60% decline in outdoor activities and the relationship to nature. And as we see the increase in technology, the increase in the built environment, that we're less engaging, and I think becoming more distracted by the things that take away from these conditions. So going back to what I mentioned earlier in terms of that, it's becoming easier to ignore or distract us from that authentic self and really wrestling with what it means to live.
Yeah, yeah. So in the conclusion of your paper, you and your colleagues have a table that connects specific existential givens and Lebensfeld dimensions to adventure therapy tenets, and adventure therapy activities. Very helpful. It's a very helpful schematic.
Hmm.
Can you take a moment to convey some ideas on linking specific activities like kayaking to some of the givens? I found it such an interesting and helpful way to frame it. Share with us a bit about how you see it all coming together.
Sure. Yeah. So this kind of holistic, somewhat bird's eye view, and I appreciate that you chose kayaking. So in Northwest Arkansas is where the Buffalo National River is, where I participate in a lot of this work. And my doctoral advisor and some friends that I've had to rescue off that river will also really appreciate this reference. So
Okay.
let's say when we're kayaking on this river, you're having to decide how to paddle, how to respond and navigate these currents and the flow. And the river is going to respond back in kind. And so that moment really embodies that sense of freedom in your decision to choose and own or take responsibility for the outcome of those choices. Because there's many moments where when we're engaging in risk that we might freeze or we might just hold still, and that might result in you going into the bank or into a tree. So this river is giving you this immediate feedback, just like life does, and you have to respond. So to make things more interesting, when you're in a group or maybe in a tandem kayak, maybe even a canoe, our focus starts to shift to that trust and belonging aspect, where we're wrestling with that mitwelt and the eigenwelt. So any couples who've ever canoed or kayaked together would likely help illuminate this with some prime examples. But I could even invite my wife in here, and she could share some of her experience. But we're having to communicate with one another, and that's oftentimes where I witness a lot of prime work to be done is in those group or tandem settings. But then lastly, as we're navigating the flow of the river and those twists and turns, you don't know what to expect. You don't know what's coming around the bend. And you're having to push past those obstacles such as rocks or tree branches. And so this ties into that metaphor for perseverance, struggle, and purpose. And you're sometimes having to reflect, why am I doing this? So I think activities like kayaking help people recognize the truth about themselves.
I hear a lot in that about the need to be responsive and attuned in the face of uncertainty. And it
Mm-hmm.
sounds like that'd be a recurring theme in a lot of these activities.
Yes, I think that again, empowering the one sense of agency and that responsibility taking, which we're called to do with from an existential approach.
Sure, sure. Okay. And so, what implications and critical ideas, let's do the 10,000-foot view,
Mhm.
do you hope the listeners will take away from your work on adventure therapy and existentialism?
Yeah, so I think if I step out, I think really the driving piece to this is that my hope is people see life is about creating these lived, embodied experiences where we're encouraged to face those big questions of existence, and that adventure therapy or connecting with our natural world offers just that opportunity. So when we do that intentionally, like I've seen with my clients or students, friends, and family, we start to wrestle with freedom, our finality, isolation, and meaning in a way that fosters our authenticity while also having fun. When we start to reflect after an activity and assign or find meaning from it, we often realize like this wasn't just about climbing or paddling. It was about how I met the challenges of being alive. And so that's where adventure therapy becomes transformative, supporting people in both developing meaning and becoming more fully themselves.
Final question. What do you think is particularly valuable about humanistic counseling?
Yes. So for me, the beauty and heart of humanistic counseling is this deep trust in people's potential. It says that you're a whole human being and you already have within you the capacity for growth, meaning and authentic living, especially when they feel safe, understood, and accepted. So that lens pairs so naturally with adventure therapy, where people are discovering that agency, their courage, their sense of purpose. So I think humanistic counseling really reinforces that their life has worth and meaning, and that AT gives them the space to embody that truth in real time, developing both meaning and a stronger sense of being. So I can't think of a more valuable message to bring into therapy than that.
I agree. Dr. Brown, it's been a pleasure talking with you today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And many thanks to you, good listeners, for spending time with us here at the Humanistic Counselor Podcast. All JHC articles can be accessed through the Wiley Online Library. If you're a member of the Association for Humanistic Counseling, then you get free access to this article and many, many others through the American Counseling Association website at www.counseling.org. If you'd like to become a member of AHC, then we hope you'll visit our website at www.humanisticcounseling.org. Thank you, be well, and hope to see you here next time on the Humanistic Counselor Podcast.